I know my title sounds kind of scary and specific, but this is mostly about problems I've been having for most of my adult life in getting good data on open access. So getting reliable, reproducible, and sustainably available and shareable data on how open access is doing. So that's what it's about, expressed in this convoluted and nice academic form. But what I'm going to talk about today isn't just about a problem with open access. It's a problem with scholarly publishing in general, that we really don't know a lot about what is really happening, considering all the types of outputs, journals, articles, publishing models we have. It's kind of a black box that we can take small peeks at and observe from different angles, limited angles, but there are many unanswered questions that we have. But I think open access is the key. It's key in opening up science to everyone, but it's also the key to making information about scholarly publishing more available. So this is a chance to open up the outputs as well as providing more transparency to the whole system at large, all the metadata and everything that goes with it. And as I mentioned, and as a caveat here, I don't have the answers to how things should be infrastructurally provided, but through my experiences in doing research on open access for over 10 years, I've found problems, some blind spots, and things that could easily be improved. And those I'm going to present to you today. So, to start with, to get your minds massaged into the right mood set here, I think some simple questions that still kind of don't really have good answers is how certain science policy decisions, for example Plan S, to figure out a way how we can assess the impact of trying to tweak the publishing environment. Like how can we know what the causal effects of implementing a specific science policy intervention is on the scholarly publishing landscape, because it affects everything, and things are so interconnected that how can we know and how should we inform ourselves in how science policy kind of steers the landscape if we have bad data of the landscape overall? And then how much about open access is really about better indexing and web crawling and better discovery? And how much is about actual organic growth in there being new journals started, more articles being put up on the web for free? Or how should we discern between better indexing and just more content? I think that's a question that is still kind of unanswered, because we can all see the percentages rising in numbers included in the DOAJ, Directory of Open Access Journals, but many of those journals have been around for years, publishing on open access. They just haven't been indexed. So how should we figure out how much open access is actually growing compared to just being better indexed? Then, something that many people have tried to answer and still are working on, probably for the rest of their lives, is to figure out how open access or article processing charges are developing over time, and how it differs between publisher types or research disciplines, or there are many different angles you can look at this, but there's really bad longitudinal data for knowing exactly how the pricing levels have evolved and will continue to evolve, since we are so bad at keeping track of it. I know that's provocative for many of you, but I'll show you some evidence soon. And then, thinking about science and scientific publishing at large, how much is science growing and compared to how open access is growing? Is the tide just raising all boats in the water, or is open access kind of outpacing the growth of science overall? We know that more and more stuff is getting published each year, but is open access kind of growing faster than science overall? We can think about that question for a while. But most of my studies, and most of the studies on open access, have been comparable to taking a camera, not an actual camera, but going on the web and taking a snapshot of what is available today from a certain population, open access by some criteria. So taking a snapshot with a camera, so to say. So you get a static picture of what's available on the web today, of what has been published in the past. This has been the methodology that is kind of been the standard for many open access studies. But then, when you have an old photograph from 2014, I know I'm becoming very abstract here. We can think of this house as open access percentages or the landscape of open access journals in 2014. You have a neat image here of how things used to look. You know, we can see certain features around this house, but if you today want to attempt to compare how much has changed since 2014, trying to use the same equipment, the same scenarios, the same circumstances, you're still going to end up with something that is really hard to compare to. You try to take a picture of the same house and try to figure out what's changed, why it's changed, but it's still so different that you can't really figure out causal relationships, and you know, the studies aren't just reproducible or comparable because the whole landscape has changed so much. So it's a problem in kind of providing reproducible measurements and data on open access. And even if you do your best, you put on your academic hat and really try to be strict about it. You have marked the spot where you are taking the photograph in 5-year intervals. You tell the house owner to not change anything in the house. You want to look at how the environment is changing around the house. You're still going to end up with small differences that you can't really explain. Like there are small changes in these pictures, these measurements, that still make it hard to figure out what's the effect of science policy, what is the effect of just better indexing, what is the effect of too expensive or too weak kind of actors in the landscape. So it's pretty much this, that you're guessing, like why are certain pieces being added or missing from the picture between measurements. Okay, this went very abstract pretty fast, but I hope you understand the kind of idea here. Rather than showing you open access percentages and graphs, the same idea kind of converts to this photograph analogy here, that currently we don't really have good data on comparing longitudinal development of open access. But how could we improve? Rather than a camera, should we set up some other measurement equipment, either bottom up, you know, placing the landscape with sensors and some kind of identifiers to monitor change? Or should we do it kind of top-down, you know, comparing to satellites, that there should be some surveillance organization keeping track of everything? Or should it be, you know, video camera? Like we should have a kind of audit trail. We should monitor every change every time it happens so that we can understand science better. Of course, all of these analogies, again, are hard to directly implement to bibliometrics and economy of publishing, but we should think along these lines that rather than having a camera, should we have some other ways of monitoring, creating data, creating observations of scholarly publishing? So this is just, again, getting you warmed up to the idea that some things may be broken and could be improved when it comes to data. And for my kind of talk today, I don't have a long table of contents or agenda here, but I've split it into two. So I want to talk a bit about bibliometric data and then how economic data intertwines with said bibliometric data. And I think the most interesting part is somewhere in between, where it becomes difficult to assign responsibility and really domain expertise when it falls between accounting, political economy, and traditional information sciences. And it becomes complicated pretty fast when you want to know more about the economic aspect than just what price you've been paying for publications. So it's very challenging, but that's why I really like the slice in between, because it's easy to look at things in their own context, like pure economic or pure bibliometric, but combining them is where you get most of the interesting juices of what's actually happening. But first, the more purely bibliometric perspective. It's not just me and researchers like me who make their living on researching open access and scholarly publishing and scholarly communication. I think society at large and actors within scientific publishing would all benefit from better data, better bibliometrics being available out in the open. It's not just a curiosity for curiosity's sake. It would facilitate better and more efficient knowledge about the landscape. And then the problem with the web is that, of course, you're being monitored wherever you go by cookies and trackers and commercial companies knowing your every move and probably tracking your eyes where you're looking. But somehow, scholarly journals have been pretty secure from this surveillance. They are maybe the worst monitored aspect of the web, where there are a lot of structured data, but still we don't really know the complete universe of how many journals there are, how many articles are there. We have different guesstimates, we have different indexes, but we don't really kind of know the full universe if we would like to have it. We can look up different indexes, but even though everything is now web-based, we still don't really have an authoritative index that would include everything, that would be kind of collected from the web. And I think that's problematic. We should have kind of a baseline for everything that's out there and then filter from there. And there are three key obstacles, as I see in the current environment, is that this commercial dominance also for bibliometric information is problematic. So Scopus, Web of Science, all our friends at these institutions have good data. It's fairly good. People work at cleaning it up and keeping it curated and recent, but it's still limited in what you can do with it. You can't really share it. You can't really build on it. You are limited to whatever they've selected for you to view as a pay-per-view option. I've compared it here to a binoculars that is coin-operated and directed at exactly the mountain they want you to see. You're limited in what you can do with that data. Then the other aspect is this longitudinal aspect missing, like amnesia. The database usually forgets. Most people, most sensible people are probably interested in what are the active journals right now, what are their APCs right now, article numbers and so forth, and that's a reasonable wish to have. But some people would like to know also historical data. What was the APC 5 years ago? What was the publishing model 5 years ago? Things that are not just about the snapshot right now, but also about the trajectory of the journal more long term. So the problem is that most of these are pretty much black boxes when it comes to knowing about how journals ended up there and what they've been doing before the day you are looking at the database. So it's of course a challenge to solve this, but it's problematic for figuring out how things are moving since you can't see other than individual snapshots of the database. And similar to the kind of binoculars idea is that these indexes that are curated and cleaned up and have nice metadata with them have very selective coverage. They don't attempt to index everything. They index certain things that fulfill their criteria, and that's not good for science overall. It would be better if we would have an open bibliometric database that we could consult and then filter from there if we want, based on certain criteria. So my wish is that we would have a more open alternative that would get rid of some of these problems. I know certain things like this amnesia aspect is hard to solve, but there should be some historical records also in addition to just the most recent news of a journal. I wouldn't like to be a historian in 100 or 200 years from now looking at scholarly communication in 2019 because we're so bad at keeping track and recording everything we're doing. Like it's a problematic aspect. And then there's a large variation for reproducibility, what you use as your population when you're looking at open access. You can consult these proprietary databases, but you can also, of course, include open access information from the DOAJ or the ROAD database that is managed by the ISSN organization. But then you are not really, it's hard to compare things that have been selected on different criteria. It would be nice to have a more complete universe of publishing and a more complete definition of what is open access to really figure out what publications are out in the open currently fulfilling certain criteria. So this is all a very creative endeavor now in putting together a measurement of open access and collecting data of a population because there's so many different ways you can go about it, good and bad. And then something that even open access experts or people who have been long in the game can't agree on is what is open access. Is it just the most liberal form of licensing that can be considered open access? Everything else is just free for the moment? Or is it, can you also consider content that is available through secondary open access mechanisms, providing free access, like, for example, green open access if it's not CC licensed, for example? Or then what about these illegal means, like some would say sci-hub is a illegal entrepreneurship, and maybe most would agree, but should you consider that open access? What about copies on ResearchGate that maybe shouldn't be there? Is that open access? So it's all very complicated when it comes down even to defining what is open access once you've decided on a population. And of course, flexibility is good, but there should be some common standards and definitions so we can move forward in actually monitoring, because everyone interprets this differently and has a different sieve that they go around filtering stuff with. Then, studies often mix together journal perspectives with article perspectives, and that makes life hard for understanding how things are actually developing, because these two are connected. Journals are publishing individual articles, but the open access status and the open access data concerning an individual articles is not necessarily dictated by the journal. So you can have self-archive copies, you can have hybrid open access, you can have a lot of different variations to complete full open access or complete subscription access. So it's very, not paradoxal, but shall we say you can spend a lifetime trying to figure things out this way, determining open access status by journal information or vice versa, and you would just get a lot of gray hairs trying to get answers or gain clarity into the situation. So it's all complicated, and I know I'm a bit of a downer now. This is bad news, not good, but we're getting forward. We've identified that things are complicated. We need to think about individual articles. We need to think about individual journals, but we shouldn't get confused. We should have clarity in how we move forward. And I think one way of providing clarity is having categorizations, classifications. This is the smallest font you'll be exposed to today, so excuse me, but I think it's useful to present kind of a developed framework for looking at in what different ways content is open to various degrees. This is a couple of years back, this open access spectrum was published, where they have like 6 different categories of how openness of articles can be kind of assessed and categorized. So I think ways like this is a way forward to tagging, to making it machine understandable in what way content is provided open access. But you can consult this more closely. It was just to present an idea that there should be some agreement on how we categorize things if we want to move forward, since things are messy. Then this is an image from a study I did a couple of years back, where I looked at ethics research and 1,600 articles within ethics research, looking at where they are available on the web. What different web locations can I find these articles on? And like most other open access studies, about half of the articles were available at least in one location as open access. But quite many of the articles were available in multiple locations as multiple different versions. So how should you collect data about this in a structured way? Should you only consider journal websites? Should you only consider repositories? Should you prioritize one or the other? Or should you have some kind of a hierarchy? You know, no one knows. I'm just saying that things are diverse and complicated and challenging to provide in a structured data form, since people use many different mechanisms currently to provide open access. So it's hard to really pin down metadata for what is a messy reality. But then, I mentioned that this has some elements of a lecture, and this is maybe the most lecture-y part of my talk, in kind of educating you on how the methodology for open access studies have developed since, well, the dawn of open access studies. I think the earliest ones came in the mid-90s somewhere, where most of the methodologies and results were anecdotal, so to say. You had people who had come across a list of journals that made content available on the web, and they wrote it up into a brief article. But then as time has moved on, you know, we got a limited perspective on it, and when I jumped into the game in around 2008, 2009, we still used manual sampling, like took a small random sample of articles and looked at the open access status from it and extrapolated. But today, people are much smarter, and computers are much better at crawling the web and scraping the web, so that we can have kind of evolved into automated sampling, where we can take hundreds of thousands, or if not millions of articles, and check the open access status of them, or then something that is close to even real time now, as I'll kind of disclose. And the most important cornerstones, I think, for today for providing open access data is, of course, provided by the ISSN organization. They provide the fundamental cornerstone of journal metadata, the authoritative ISSN number, publisher, journal title. This is not longitudinal data, but they are improving and trying to keep up with how fast things are changing in the digital realm. And I do think that this is a good foundation to stand on. Then in the late 90s, Crossref was founded, started with the DOI identificator, which is now the de facto way of having persistent identifiers to content. And it's also a key, as we'll see, to the real-time open access measurement. The DOAJ was started in 2003 with a couple of hundred journals, and it's now grown to around 13,000 journals. 14,000 journals almost today. It keeps rising a lot, but it's been a key resource for me, and it's still kind of the authoritative repository for just a list of open access journals that fulfill common criteria. It's not all journals, all open access journals, but it's a very transparent and kind of good, cleaned up list of active journals. Google Scholar has been used for many studies looking bottom up what articles are available through other mechanisms than through DOAJ journals, like where on the web can we find stuff. And then, very recently, in 2017, Unpaywall entered the picture, and I would say that's kind of a game changer, since they provide article-level open access categorization based on the DOI identificator. So that's kind of the gold standard for evaluating article-level open access status now, and for getting open access data on articles. And kind of the best journal-level analysis or data there is provided by Walt Crawford, who produces an annual ebook and an open data set based on the DOAJ. And he has, in the past, manually collected article numbers from journal websites. So, entering things by hand, copy-pasting, visiting each website and doing it. And of course, it doesn't sound like a good time if that's kind of the gold standard of scholarly publishing, and the knowledge that we have to do this manual thing about things that are already on the web. I think we can do better in trying to make Walt's life easier, not having to do this manual annual exercise in aggregating bibliometric information into the covers, but having some kind of system that would do this more automatically. Provide APC numbers, provide article volumes, provide a lot of different meta information for journals. So it's a very valuable resource, and I really applaud the effort, but I think we should evolve, trying to automate this thing and make it more real-time, so that it wouldn't need to be a person that's kind of the glue between bibliometrics and some kind of a knowledge and insight into the phenomenon. But this is a great ebook. I recommend everyone to have a look at it, and focuses on the DOAJ open access journals. I already praised Unpaywall once. I'll do it once again. I think it's the gold standard for figuring out open access status and data for individual articles. They've published a great paper where they've looked at the data set they have. Of course, this is, again, a snapshot study. I don't think much content was open access in the 1950s. It's just what of the content published at that point in time was available in 2017, 2016. So it's always problematic to go back in time and see what the status was, for example, in the early 90s. But this is the best we can do without a time machine. And this is also a paper I recommend both open access advanced people as well as beginners to kind of consult, because it's really an interesting look at the different mechanisms and the growth that has been happening within them in recent years. And one thing I'm really happy about that I saw on Twitter, it's a month ago now, where Unpaywall mentioned that based on their data, they know which journals have 100% open access without being indexed in the DOAJ. So basically, they are using these article level data about what is open on the web based on DOIs to then classify journals as open access journals and release that as kind of a data set. So it seems like they will be able to add a long list, thousands of new known open access journals based on then bottom-up crawling the web. So I think that's really promising, and I think this is the right approach to trying to get a universal listing of open access journals. Then the DOAJ is good. We know those journals adhere to certain criteria, but having a complete list for anyone and everyone that's interested is also valuable and something I'm really looking forward to. But then, where things get messy and is where people create messes. No, I'm joking here, but where journals kind of flip. Like, for example, Lingua to Glossa or a Journal of Informatics to Quantitative Science Studies. How should this be kind of interpreted in the data? How should we code this? This is kind of a social thing happening, and maybe it'll spread, maybe it'll become a big thing, and we need to be able to code it somehow to kind of follow it and monitor it and understand how this phenomenon works. But there are many exceptions in scholarly publishing like this, where we should be able to kind of capture kind of the essence, to understand how things work, that entire editorial boards are leaving journals to form new journals that are based on open access. Because that's something that I think science policy would be interested in monitoring, but it's not really something we're able to capture other than anecdotally or following headlines or things like that. You know, things are hidden under the layer of bibliometrics. Then another issue I'm kind of concerned and interested in is journals disappearing. Like, this is a snapshot, a figure from a study I did a couple of years ago together with my colleagues at Hanken, where we looked at open access journals that were active in 2002 to how many were active still in 2014. And around half of those journals had become inactive, or some of them even disappeared. So, and usually these are cleaned off from indexes. Like the DOAJ, for example, throws out journals that are inactive. So you are kind of losing information. And other indexes as well are also interested in active outlets mostly. So I think it's interesting to also follow what's happening outside of what is just active and going well today, to kind of have data also that captures things changing over time. As I said, I don't have the answers how this would happen, but I think it needs to be captured somehow, how things are also not failing, but shall we say, not remaining active, if I can be so diplomatic. Then another study, this sounds like a self-promotion pitch here, but a study I did on a journal flip within philosophy, where they kind of evaluated between going either open access or then doing compromises. Like they got different offers from publishers to be delayed open access or to be subscription-based but have free access to society members. They had to pay a lot more if they wanted to be open access compared to if they remained subscription-based. And they kind of had to wrestle with feasibility. Like for a journal that is going well, has a healthy number of subscribers, going open access could be a compromise economically, but also a compromise in the editorial board doing more volunteer effort, like taking more control of the journal, taking more responsibility and being more independent from a publisher, if they don't want to go the APC route where they get money funneled in, which can be problematic in the humanities to have an APC-driven journal that actually turns out like an economic break-even. So open access is not like it's not a solution, automatic solution. You need to cater for it, and you need to figure out what kind of model works for a journal. And this is where some journals have then reverse flipped. This is also a recent study I participated in, where we looked at open access journals that have gone back or converted back to subscription-based, where there were around 150 journals that were still active today that had at one point been open access. So how should this be kind of coded and noticed in any open access data that we have? Because these journals have been thrown out of the DOAJ, they are in Scopus, but you're not really, most of them are in Scopus, not all of them. But how should we kind of understand, like what can this phenomenon of journals going back to subscription-based tell us about how science policy is doing or how different disciplines are taking on to open access. This is all very tricky, and these are marginal things maybe, but I think they are aspects that would need to be considered because they inform us about how things are going. And the best the European Commission can do when it comes to open access monitoring is roughly this, a very high level division into gold open access, green open access, and not open access. So I think this is very problematic because just looking at these kind of high level figures for global all publishing in overall over multiple years, how much can you really say about what's going on other than that a percentage is going either up or down or comparing these snapshots with each other from different years? I think we need to do better than this because this level of data is not really good enough to inform science policy or inform even, the world about how scientific publishing is doing, because a lot is bubbling under the surface and exists in tension with economic interests. So, the most viable way is not really the video camera, that's what I argue. We should not, the camera, that's not what I argue. For getting information about how things used to be in the past, we would basically need a time machine. We need to be able to go back in time and figure out, what was open access in 1993, Marty. We got to go back and figure out, exactly what happened, because we can't rely on the information we have today because we've been bad at keeping track. And this is something I've been kind of exploring in a lot of this research about these reverse flips and disappeared journals, but also for figuring out the origins of current open access journals. So looking at journals indexed in Scopus, I know I just kind of bad-mouthed the index, but here I am. Looking at open access journals indexed in Scopus, looking at which ones were born as open access ones or which one converted to the model, can bring some insight into how open access is developing. We can see growth here. Most open access figures show growth. That's, I guess, a positive thing. But if we look at it on a year-on-year basis, how many journals were kind of started open access publishing, we can see that early on, before the year 2000, there was a lot of journals that had converted to open access already. And in the more recent years, that's all recent from my perspective, 10 years back, most of them were born open access journals. So that I think there are trends happening in kind of commercial interests coming into the picture, creating new journals. And early on, it might have been more not philanthropic, but shall we say, journals converting to open access, not just purely of business interest, but perhaps just of the digitalization facilitating such a model. So I think all of this is interesting because we shouldn't just look at percentages and increasing diagrams. We should try to understand what's really happening over time, because that is, I guess, the key thing I'm kind of barking at here. Then for this kind of a smaller slice I had here about economics is that we know relatively little about the relationship between cost and price. I think most of us would agree that scholarly publishing from the customer side is expensive, extortionately expensive, and we should strive to make it more cost efficient and also try to cut more of the just commercial profits and dividends out of the picture. So we can agree on that, but just how much are we paying too much and how much can we improve is the big question. And here, a hard fact that I want everyone to understand is that if you are a stock exchange listed company, you are not going to accept a zero growth in profits. Like that is not on your agenda. You want to avoid any scenario where things are standing still because all of the stock exchange valuations are based on expectations of future profit and growth. So as long as we have commercial actors involved, they are not going to want to make things cheaper and less expensive. Like they are going to do the exact opposite. Like we can't expect to have them deliver us free, comprehensive, open access data that exposes the weak spots and all the interesting in-betweens, because currently they want to entrench the market with different products and services, own large journal portfolios, and it's problematic. Like it's the relationship between economics, profits, and bibliometrics is something that would need more digging into. But one thing, many of you might be familiar with this graph, but I think it's a classic and needs to be shown in these circumstances, is kind of the evolution, again, over time. That's beautiful. Evolution over time of how journals migrated from smaller publishers to bigger publishers in tandem with digitalization. Because in the early days, digital journal publishing was hard. You know, there weren't templates and frameworks and open source solutions and service providers for various things in the workflow. It was pretty problematic to set up a good web-based website in the 90s. So that's why many people jumped on the bandwagon to the big publishers and kind of facilitated the transition of growing these oligopolies to the size they are today. And this does not only have to do with kind of bibliometrics and economics of the publishing landscape. These companies are also capturing markets around publishing for writing, for analysis, for registering, for evaluating, be it what it may. This is an interesting study of academic or scholarly communications startups where the author looked at what the time is for kind of exit strategies. When these startups were purchased by a investor, usually a large commercial publisher, and turned into their portfolio of services and products. So this is very much a thing that is happening, and of course I'm happy for the startups that made money on this. They achieved their goals, but we shouldn't build our open access data on kind of a commercial ground that has a 7-year perspective on exiting the market. We should figure out a way that we can have a sustainable ground that won't be sold to the highest bidder when times get tough. It should be more sustainable than that. And one thing which I think is interesting for anyone who's into this stuff, I don't know if anyone is, but kind of how things are moving from hand to hand. It's kind of like a stock exchange, how journals get transferred between publishers. The ISSN has a website called the journaltransfer.org, where you can see incoming and outgoing journals from publishers. And you can see how they are kind of traded as securities in a way, that they are bought and sold, and you can, I'm happy that there is kind of a trace of this, that you can monitor how journals are trading hands and going from independent to big publishers or between big publishers, and can kind of figure out things in this way. But I've seen very few studies or any kind of observations of what this really means, because you can look at it on different ways, like who is giving away the journal or selling it and who is kind of receiving it. And I think that would inform things as well for science policy or for information science in general, like how are things evolving? Because things are changing hands constantly, and figuring out what the trends are could help us know more about open access. Like, how does this influence open access? Are they transferred and flipped to open access? Are they transferred and closed? What happens? I don't have the answers, but I just know that there are things happening. And one thing that would help the economic aspect of this is if we would have more transparency, both on a higher level, but also on a closer zoomed-in level of the landscape, where we would figure out where the money is coming from funders and public bodies, and how it's funneled through various institutions, and even there it's paid as individual invoices and part of it as big deals. Figuring out all the money flows that go into the pockets of publishers and facilitates publishing. I think this would be a healthy exercise. As part of this paper where I took this figure from, they did it for the United Kingdom. And I really applaud the effort, because I've tried to do the same in Finland. And I think I stopped after a week when I got so buried into the kind of the sources of money, going from tax-paying funds to how it's funneled through ministries to through institutions and through many pockets before it ends up on some bank account in the Bahamas, that it's really a challenge to follow the money, because it changes hand, and it's not the same euro that goes from the public bodies to the publishers. It's kind of, something happens along the way, and you need to be aware of how things are distributed once that happens. But one thing which is a great foundation, and I think is the kind of excellent starting point to getting insight, is the Open APC initiative that has been featured here as well in multiple sessions. I think that's the key, that in order to get this top top-level view of where the money is coming from and where it's going, we at least need to connect the dots between bibliometrics and economics, that we know that the publication is associated with a euro or dollar or yuan amount and can kind of go from there. Because we need to have the article as the smallest molecule. Atom is, I guess, the smallest molecule, smallest component here, but I'm getting way out of my depth here. But we need to kind of have very detailed data in order then to zoom out. That's what I'm kind of getting at. We can't start from the top. We shouldn't look at the sources of money. We should look at where it's going and work ourselves backwards. I think that's a much more helpful approach, and that's something that the Open APC initiative is helping with. And something I'm happy with that Finland has also been very active in is publishing publisher agreements. Like, this helps out with transparency in many ways, in trying to get economic pressure on publishers to slightly slow down the thirst for more money, to try to also have some communication between the customer side. Because the publishers are global enterprises that have all the information, while customers are usually regional, national, maybe communicating with other countries, but rarely international in the sense that they would have the international leverage. So I think it's a very good development that there is more international information sharing and things happening in this regard, even though there's a lot to do to turn this into some kind of data. These are mostly just scanned PDFs or bare bones tables. And then, bridging the gap between kind of cost and price is a good preprint recently published where they looked at what it actually costs to provide most of the central steps that go into kind of professional publishing nowadays, to try to assess what the gap is between a 3,000 euro APC for hybrid and then what the actual costs might be if you kind of do all the work yourself or outsource it. And they came to the amount of around $400. They have multiple scenarios there that you can have a look at, but this is a great way of trying to figure out what are we talking about? Like, what is the value of the labor and the time put into the different steps that go into producing a journal article from a publisher's perspective. And there are developments, I also seen SCOS coming up in other sessions here for funding development of what I'm talking about these open infrastructures that would help us understand more about open access and what's happening. But the problem is that there isn't really free money in large quantities to go around for this, because we are paying through the nose for subscription access and to commercial publishers. So whatever's left can then be funneled to SCOS, but it will need to improve and grow in scope, both in contributions and also in the kind of infrastructures that are there. Primarily, it's now DOAJ and Sherpa Romeo, but there could also be others that could sign up to this and make it like a viable alternative to contribute to financially for institutions. This is, again, too much reading for a presentation, really, but I think there is a need for further collective action on this, kind of collaboration to agree on data standards, agree on data collection methods. Open APC is a great collective action example of how you can kind of feed into the same database with information you're sitting on and which wouldn't otherwise be shared. And one kind of radical commitment by Lewis some years ago was about libraries reserving some percentages of their budget to fund open infrastructures, to fund things that are common, open source projects and things that don't really get the money it would deserve in order for us to get the more open data future that we want. And I think this is something worth to think about, that it's hard to argue that an optional invoice is a priority when you are cutting down access to valuable resources, but something has to be done. Like, if we want the future to be open, have more open data on what's happening, we also need to fund it. It can't just be a shoestring operation. And there needs to be better metadata for all the actors. I'm usually against web surveillance or any tracking, but I think, like scholarly publishing, it's not really about personal data. We should be able to identify individuals, journals, funders, you name it, organizations, well enough so that we could have good databases of how these interact, so that we could analyze what's happening. It's not about the negative connotation of surveillance. I think it's just a matter of kind of accounting, bookkeeping. Like scholarly publishing shouldn't be comparable to, the horrible things that Facebook does with your data. It's not the same thing. I've heard people really against opening up scholarly publishing and trying to tag everything and anything, but I don't think I don't think that argument holds. I think we should do better in having identifiers for the central actors so that we can also see how things are moving. And of course, ORCID is a good initiative in this regard, trying to at least identify authors so that we are not just relying on Scopus proprietary mechanisms for identifying authors to figure out affiliations and collaboration networks, but we can do better. Like it should spread to organizations and funders and so forth. And an interesting development that is kind of in line with this about being more metadata-centric and having everything identified is something I heard was advertised on the OWASPA conference some week back about the open access switchboard. I haven't really digested it all, but it sounds like kind of like a dating matching service. Like an author goes into the service and tries to find journals that match their funder criteria and their organizational policy. So kind of like a dating service almost, like authors logging into the service and not having to navigate the jungle of price capping or embargo times or copyright, that they would have kind of all of that coded from the start based on who they are funded by, where they work, and what journals are within their field that fulfill these properties. I guess this is good-ish, but I haven't really figured out what this means. It sounds like a good development that it's more easy to navigate the jungle of different variables that are moving around in open access. But I think we still need to figure out how this will work for not just being, then again, a very publisher-controlled environment and able to kind of guide contributions to journals that buy premium partners of this service. Maybe I'm too cynical. But hey, my key takeaways and kind of reiterations here is that things are messy, but things are also improving. Like some 10 years ago when I started studying open access, there was nothing. Like you had the DOAJ and you could manually sample journals and make something out of it, but you couldn't get a lot of knowledge out of it. Now you have APIs provided by Unpaywall, you have Crossref providing fantastic metadata for publications that they index. There are not limitless possibilities, but a lot more possibilities, and new ones are coming up every day. But we still should have a vision for where we want to end up, what kind of questions do we want answered, and who should be controlling the data. And I know I use these buzzwords here of sustainability and reproducibility, and I still hold on to that. Like, it should be financially sustainable. We should motivate institutions to contribute financially to this, so that it's not just publishers shoving in barrel loads of money to fund infrastructures that cater to their interests. There should be some pockets of money also coming in from universities and governments to kind of facilitate open infrastructures. So it's all not bad, and I think reproducibility is getting better, like the reminder of the house there. Now we have better possibilities to really fix variables, to really compare how the landscape was 5 years ago to how it's now. We have gotten better, the tools have gotten better, and things are constantly improving. So it's not just negative here. But what I'd like to emphasize is that still, bibliometrics is very snapshot-driven. We need to do better at having longitudinal data. I would we should treat publications like human lives, that we have a birth certificate and major life events and then maybe a death certificate. But some closure. I would just need some kind of closure to what's happening to journals, because it seems like they are mostly flying in the dark when it comes to knowing about what's happening on the journal level. But thank you. That is most of what I had for today. If you're still thirsty for more, I produced a YouTube video in my sauna in the summer where I review some of these topics. You can pause it and enjoy all the details there, digest it in a slower fashion. And then I also published a blog post on the Elephant in the Lab blog about some of the things I mentioned here, but I kind of go more into depth about the motivations. But danke.